Look at this image. What you're seeing is not a natural phenomenon. It's not a weather pattern, and it's definitely not an optical illusion. This is the Korean Peninsula at night. The South is blazing with light, a testament to one of the most successful economic transformations in human history. The North is almost completely dark, not because there's no one there. 26 million people call this place home. But because in North Korea, electricity is a luxury that most citizens can only dream of. In 2023, South Korea's economy was 57 times larger than its northern neighbor. The average South Korean earns over $36,000 a year. The average North Korean, just over $1,800. These are just statistics. They represent a story of how two nations, sharing the same language, the same history, and the same people, ended up in completely different universes. Welcome to the tragedy of North Korea, and this is why it's poor. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to 1945. When World War II ended, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union controlled the industrial north. The United States controlled the agricultural south. It was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent. Then came the Korean War. From 1950 to 1953, the peninsula was devastated. 3 million people died. When the dust settled, two Koreas emerged, each claiming to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. But here's where it gets interesting. In those early years, North Korea had every advantage. It inherited most of the heavy industry built by Japan during colonial rule. Power plants, steel mills, chemical factories, they were all in the north. In 1960, per capita income in North and South Korea was roughly equal, about $1,100. Some estimates even suggest the North was slightly ahead. Through the 1960s and early 1970s, North Korea was the success story. While South Korea struggled with corruption and political instability, the North boasted impressive industrial output. Soviet and Chinese aid poured in. By some measures, North Korea was growing faster than South Korea. But then, something changed. Around 1975, the lines crossed. South Korea's economy began to accelerate, driven by exports, manufacturing, and eventually technology. North Korea's growth stalled, then reversed. The divergence had begun. The 1990s brought what North Koreans call the Arduous March. Historians call it one of the worst famines of the late 20th century. Between 1994 and 1999, somewhere between 240,000 and 3.5 million people died of starvation and hunger-related diseases. That's up to 5% of the entire population gone. What caused this catastrophe? The North Korean government blamed floods and droughts. But the real causes were political and economic. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, North Korea lost its primary trading partner and source of subsidized fuel and food. Soviet imports to North Korea plummeted from $2 billion in 1990 to less than $300 million in 1991. China, which also normalized relations with South Korea in 1992, demanded market prices for its goods. The subsidy stopped. North Korea's economy was built on a lie. It was a command economy centrally planned where the government set production targets and controlled every aspect of economic life. This system only worked with massive external support. When that support vanished, the entire structure crumbled. The public distribution system, which provided food rations to most citizens, collapsed. People were forced to fend for themselves. Black markets emerged. Farmers began hiding crops. For the first time, North Koreans experienced the failure of their government not as propaganda, but as empty stomachs and dead family members. The regime's response? Gobbled down on ideology. The concept of Jewish or self-reliance became not just a philosophy, but a survival strategy. Never mind that North Korea was completely dependent on foreign aid. The narrative had to be maintained even as people starved. North Korea's poverty isn't an accident. It's a feature of a system designed to maintain power at the expense of prosperity. The command economy sounds efficient in theory. Central planners allocate resources. set prices, and direct production. No wasteful competition, no exploitation, just rational economic management. In practice, it's a disaster. Without market signals, planners have no idea what to produce or how much. Factories churn out goods that nobody wants, while basic necessities disappear. Prices become meaningless. Money is just paper. In North Korea, the government has conducted multiple currency reforms, wiping out people's savings overnight. 9. A currency revaluation sparked protests, a rare display of public anger in a country where dissent is punishable by death. Then there's the military. North Korea practices what's called Songun, or military-first politics. The armed forces get priority for everything: food, fuel, technology, and talent. Estimates suggest that North Korea spends between 15 and 25% of its GDP on defense. For comparison, South Korea spends less than 3%, and even the United States spends under 4%. This military obsession comes at a direct cost to civilian welfare. While North Korea develops nuclear missiles that can reach the United States, its people lack reliable electricity, adequate food, and basic medical care. International sanctions have made things worse. Following nuclear tests in 2006, 2009, 2016, and beyond, the United Nations imposed increasingly strict sanctions. North Korea's exports collapsed. Its access to international banking was cut off. Even legitimate trade became nearly impossible. But here's the crucial point. Sanctions accelerated decline. They didn't cause it. North Korea's economy was already failing before the sanctions tightened. The country's leadership made a conscious choice: nuclear weapons over economic development, isolation over integration, regime survival over citizen welfare. Today, the two Koreas might as well be on different planets. In South Korea, the average citizen lives to 83 years. In North Korea, life expectancy is around 72, a gap that widened by 3 years for women during the famine. South Koreans are, on average, 3 to 8 centimeters taller than their northern cousins, a biological marker of childhood nutrition that will persist for generations. South Korea has the world's fastest internet and highest smartphone penetration. So, North Korea's internet is essentially a closed intranet, accessible only to the elite. While South Korean teenagers create content on TikTok and YouTube, North Korean teenagers have never heard of these platforms. The contrast extends to basic infrastructure. South Korea's high-speed rail network connects the entire country. In North Korea, most roads are unpaved. South Korean cities have 24-hour electricity. North Korean cities have scheduled blackouts. Rural areas often have no power at all. Perhaps most telling is the human element. When North Koreans escape to the south, they experience profound culture shock. The technology, the abundance, the freedom of speech, it's overwhelming. Many struggle to adapt. Some even miss aspects of their old life. Not the poverty, but the simplicity and the sense of community that deprivation ironically creates. The tragedy is that this division is artificial. These are the same people. They share the same language, the same history, the same cultural DNA. In 1950, no one could have predicted that one Korea would become a global economic powerhouse while the other would struggle to feed its people. Conclusion, 1345 to 15 o'clock. So why is North Korea poor? It's not because of geography. The North has abundant natural resources, including coal, iron ore, and rare earth minerals. It's not because of the people. North Koreans are hardworking and educated. It's not even solely because of sanctions or foreign pressure. North Korea is poor because of choices made by 3 generations of leaders who prioritized political control over economic freedom, who invested in missiles instead of medicine, who built nuclear weapons while their people starved, who turned a nation with enormous potential a warning sign for what happens when ideology trumps reality. The satellite image doesn't lie. In a world of increasing connectivity and prosperity, North Korea remains a dark spot, literally and figuratively. But it doesn't have to be this way. The same Korean people, given different institutions, different policies, and different leadership, built one of Asia's most dynamic economies in the South. The Korean Peninsula is a controlled experiment in political economy. Same people, same history, same starting point. Different systems, different outcome. The lights in the south prove what's possible. The darkness in the north shows what happens when a government fears its own people more than it cares for their welfare. And that, more than anything else, is why North Korea is poor.